Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of faith and pop culture and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. Jay Sherer, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Yeah, so a quick bit about you. You're the founder of Reclamation Society and also the co-host of Story Geeks podcast.
That's right. I wore my logo wear today.
You did. I love it. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk, kind of picking up where we did last week, where we left off last week. So last week, Krista and I talked about why geek culture matters, why we're even having this conversation.
Sure.
And so hopefully if people haven't seen that clip, they'll go back and watch it. And now we're going to talk about like how we can authentically engage in geek culture. But first, let's look at kind of a common criticism that we might receive. It's that for Christians, people might be concerned that we're even attaching our faith to things of this world. So how would you respond to those types of concerns?
I think it's a really valid concern, first and foremost. I think there was a methodology of evangelism called DBS, and I can't remember what it stood for, but essentially it was taking biblical stories and walking people through them and asking, what does it reveal about God? What does it reveal about human nature? What does it reveal about the world that we live in at large? And it worked really, really well internationally, but it didn't work as well in the States. And so one of the things that we try to do on the Story Geeks is we try and say, I realize that I can't always take Christianity, at least in my marketplace with geeks, and just throw it in your face and have you respond to it. But what I can do is I can ask those same questions about the stories that culture is telling. Today's world, it's all geek stories. So what are we dealing with? We're dealing with geek things. And so what I like to do is I like to say, let's ask those same questions. What does this story reveal to us about spirituality? And where is that good or where is that bad? How does that resonate with you? And you can have those conversations with anybody and then work in your perspectives on faith and spirituality and Jesus Christ into those conversations. It's a really nice entree into a conversation that's very deep. Otherwise, it's really hard to have those conversations, especially in this fast go world, to really slow down and have those conversations. But I think a lot of geek stories allow us to do that if we're willing.
Right. And I think what you're saying is a lot like what we're told through Paul and what he tells us about becoming all things to all people. And it's really for God's glory and to bring those blessings, the truth of Scripture to different audiences. So that's really, I think, my motivation, and I think yours as well, that's why we are sharing and speaking that geek language. It's not because we're just so enamored with the world.
Right.
But again, those criticisms come up, and one of them is specifically that we water down the gospel. So how would you look at that question?
Yeah, I think that there's always a danger of watering down the gospel. But at the same time, the gospel is good news. I think a lot of times, especially in geek culture, if I were to go and show them a televangelist video, most televangelists, I'm making a generalization here, they're going to instantly reject that outright. And honestly, if you take a look at that from their perspective, you're probably going to reject that on their behalf outright as well. Because there's nothing that feels authentic about that. As you talk about Paul is ingraining himself in a culture, not so that he can kind of beat the culture over the head with his perspective, but that he can come to terms with how that culture deals with stories, deals with messages, and then address it from that perspective so that there's relationship there and so that he is authentic. Because one of the things I would not advise, if you're not a geek, don't try and have conversations with people about geek stuff and then use that as a bait and switch to talk about Christianity. Live authentically out of yourself being a geek or whatever other marketplace that you're in. Live authentically out of that and then have deep conversations with people in a way that they understand because they're like you. You're like-minded in a way.
Right. And I think you make a point about if you're not a geek to not have those conversations, but I would kind of counter that and say, you know what, but we can at least ask questions because there are people who aren't scientists, but they're asking scientists, what are some questions that you have about, how did we get here? What is our purpose? And so you can ask questions. So for the non-geeks, don't be discouraged. You can still step into conversation. You might not know the history of, every Marvel character. But, you can still have conversations at least and ask questions.
Not only that, but what you can do is listen.
Right.
So I think one of the biggest things is the televangelist that I'm criticizing is not listening. They're speaking. In a culture that doesn't listen much anymore, you can invite someone into a deep conversation and you can know nothing about the subject matter. But that is just a place for you to be able to listen to their perspective, listen to what's going on in their life, listen to why they're resonating with some of the things that they're seeing in some of their favorite stories, and then just ask them why. Why do you resonate with that? What makes you resonate with that? What makes you feel love? What makes you feel peace? What makes you feel joy? What makes you feel hope? Guess what? Those are all things that we celebrate at Advent with the advent of Jesus Christ coming into the world. So we get a chance to talk about those things if we go deep with them. But I think it's really important, if you're not a geek especially, to listen first and see where they're coming from and not assume that you understand.
Right. Those are excellent points. And I know if people want to hear more about just your journey, they can check out reclamationsociety.org.
That's right.
And they can also find the Story Geeks podcast there.
Yeah, or you can go to thestorygeeks.com and get directly to all the podcast stuff.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jay. If you want to hear more from Jay, check out thestorygeeks.com.